I've watched a talk given by a Fanatics executive who sort of says this explicitly at a Sloan conference a few years ago, where she says, we have all this data. We know if you're depositing more money more quickly than you used to, if you're placing more bets on a weeknight, if you're getting a bunch of credit card deposits that are declined, we can tell if you are running into trouble, if you are gambling more than you should, if your sort of risk factor is going up per se. So the question is, okay, it's amazing that Fanatics has that data, but who at Fanatics has that data and what is it being used for?
I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capitalisn't, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should kill the capital system in the process.
Luigi, quick question before we start. Do you want to make a bet?
You'll really regret this. On what?
On whether you're going to say the phrase, this is a perverse incentive, in the next 5 minutes.
That's not a fair bet. That's inside information.
Okay, fine. I'll give you even odds.
Even out of something that is almost certain to happen? This already sounds like modern gambling.
See, you're already playing.
What's the stake?
If you say it, you owe me coffee. If you don't, I owe you coffee. Actually, scratch that. Let's make it wine.
So either way, someone is extracting value.
And neither of us is producing anything.
Congratulations. You've just described the second fastest growing sector in the U.S. economies in the last few years. Platforms like Kalshi and Polymarket are part of a much broader explosion of legalized gambling that is dissolving all boundaries between sports fandom and sport betting and between investing and wagering. What once looked like careful price discovery or hedging now increasingly resembles speculation on real-world events, from election to interest rate, using the language and mechanics of markets. The result is a culture where betting is everywhere and risk-taking is normalized, whether you call it entertainment, trading, or investment. As today's guest, Jonathan Cohen, the author of Losing Big, American Reckless Bet on Sport Gambling, points out, it took us 30 or 40 years for state lotteries to get to almost 40 states. Sport gambling did it in 7 years.
And in October 2025, federal prosecutors and the FBI unsealed indictments charging current and former NBA players and coaches with participating in a sports betting conspiracy that allegedly used insider information to place profitable wagers and commit wire fraud and money laundering offenses. While illegal underground betting has always existed, the scale and the profit motive depend on the huge liquidity and access of today's legal sports books.
Because I want to buy you that glass of wine, I'm going to phrase it in this way. In normal markets, businesses prosper by providing better services to their customers. In this market, businesses prosper by hooking addicted customers and squeezing them as much as they can until they go bankrupt. These are really perverse incentives.
Ha. I win. But I think we both wanted to win so we could both have our glass of wine. Anyway, Cohen also says that studies find a correlation between a state's legalization of online sports betting and reduced financial health for its residents, including reduced savings for lower-income households. Now that this gambling model, is expanding behind sports into elections, geopolitics, and news itself, maybe there are some lessons to learn from what has happened in sports betting. What laws built this system, who benefits from it, and what happens when betting becomes part of our life.
I don't know if you noticed that in discussing one addiction, betting, you offer to bet on two different addictions, coffee and wine.
Well, I never said I didn't have an addictive personality. I guess I just choose. Maybe we all pick our poison, right? You trace much of what has happened to the fall of something called PASPA in 2018. Why did that happen? And why, historically, was betting illegal?
So PASPA, the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, came about in the early 1990s at the behest of the sports leagues, when states started thinking about legalizing this thing that actually wasn't sports gambling, but was sort of maybe kind of resembled sports gambling. But the sports leagues saw it as sort of the camel's nose under the tent for broader legal sports gambling. And they went to Congress and said, Congress, sports gambling is bad. You cannot allow states to legalize it. Congress sort of indulges them and passes the Professional Amateur Sports Protection Act, which doesn't make sports gambling illegal, but it stops states from legalizing sports gambling. it's one of those Supreme Court decisions that's nominally about one thing, but of course is actually about something else. So it's nominally about sports gambling, but it's actually about states' rights. And it's actually about the 10th Amendment and what's called the commandeering statute. And so the Supreme Court decides states are allowed to decide sports gambling for themselves as of May 14th, 2018, 10:01 a.m. Sports gambling is not the law of the land, but states were now free to choose whether or not they were going to offer legal sports gambling and in what form.
But not that I'm a legal scholar, but the Supreme Court decision was the right decision. If I understood correctly your book, you're not against legalization of betting, but you use the term reckless in the subtitle of your book because you're against a reckless liberalization. Can you explain to us what's the difference between a normal legalization and a reckless legalization?
You've got right to the heart, and that the word reckless is sort of the key word in the title, which is, I think, I'm actually. Thank you, Bethany, for the introduction. I would not call myself a legal scholar, but I guess I'll take it. My mother-in-law will be very happy to hear that. Right, as far as I can tell, the Murphy decision was sort of correctly decided, so to speak, and so it's a matter of, okay, if we're going to have legal sports gambling in this country, should we have a process by which we learn from, let's say, other countries like in Europe that have had legal online sports gambling for the past few decades? Should we learn from Nevada, which has had legal full-throated gambling since 1931? Or should, within 6 weeks of the Supreme Court decision, Delaware have legal gambling, and within a year, should Pennsylvania, basically for the first time in this country, allow people to bet frictionlessly on their cell phone on any sports game that they want? So that, to me, is sort of the reckless version, and there's all sorts of negative externalities that we can talk about that came from not just the fact that sports gambling arrived, and I think the problem actually is not that sports gambling is here. It's the way we rolled it out so quickly and so recklessly, so heedlessly, that allowed for all of these problems, both when it comes to the legal market and when it comes to the illegal market, that it sort of hasn't gone away as a result.
So is there a simple answer to a fairly basic question, which is why have 38 states legalized sports betting at this point in time?
If you have to ask why a state is legalizing any form of gambling, the answer is always money. Our lawmakers are not so beneficent that they want to allow people to have fun and to gamble. They are beneficent because they want to raise tax-free government revenue from forms of gambling. And so whether or not it is actually an effective form of tax revenue, we can talk about, but that is fundamentally, I think, the carrot that is dangled in front of states that gets them to sort of plunge us further and further into the gambling economy.
So I have to admit, I'm not a major sport fan. The only sport that occasionally I used to watch was when Italy was in the World Cup, and it's not qualified for many years. So I don't watch sport, and I hate betting. So I'm not really the right candidate for this podcast. However, I found your book very interesting because to me is a metaphor, something much bigger that is taking place. And I would call the fight of David against Goliath in the sense that at least I used to be raised in a libertarian tradition where personal responsibility, you make your choice, etc., etc. And this is all nice and well, except that now the consumer is facing an army of PhDs in psychology trying to force him or her to do what the company wants and not what you want. So can you explain to us how devious this industry is? Because it's not the old play that you go to an old bookie and you make a bet. Is something completely different that really takes advantage of every little nuances of weakness you have in life.
Right. And I agree with you just in terms of wanting to be reflexively libertarian when it comes to letting people sort of enjoy their life and make their own decisions, even bad ones, but then looking at what is happening and what these apps are and how different they are and saying, okay, this is a different category. To start with the UX design, of the platforms themselves, casinos are notorious for taking the clocks off the wall, not putting any windows on, pumping oxygen. They can't, pump oxygen through your phone. I bet they would if they could, but there's sort of other little tricks of the display to sort of keep you engaged and sort of mimic what you call the endless scroll phenomenon of social media, where there's an endless number of games to bet on, endless number of micro events within a game to bet on. So it's not just you bet on the Knicks and then you sort of put your phone down and watch it for 3 hours. It's you bet on the Knicks and then you can bet on who's going to score the first bucket of the second quarter and then who's going to hit the next free throw and so on. And so to sort of continuous engagement, sort of mimicking a slot machine where you just want to keep pulling the lever, keep pulling the lever, keep pulling the lever. And then, okay, 2:00 in the morning comes around, there's no more American sports to bet on, but you can bet on minor league British darts or Dutch table tennis or whatever the case may be. Again, for the purposes of continued engagement. And not to mention the fact that you can get an auspiciously timed bonus offer when you haven't logged in a couple of days, or maybe when your paycheck, on the day your paycheck arrives. Not to mention that some of these companies have or all these companies really, have VIP hosts, as they're called. So actual people whose job it is to sort of engage and entice large volume bettors and lure them in with things like free iPhones and free tickets to the Super Bowl or whatever to try to sort of keep them playing. So this is not your father's sports book. This is not sort of Las Vegas anymore. And as problematic as Las Vegas was, I think we're sort of entered a new epoch.
What I find it interesting is there is a natural resistance to gambling. That's the reason why so many Colorado voters voted against. The fact that there was this immediate push for it by legislators who, as we know, they tend to be financed by many gambling casinos, etc. And actually, the simple voters say no is quite telling that this is what was pushed down the throat of a lot of people. Now, what I find it funny is one of the few states that does not have online betting is Mississippi, and not out of the benevolence of the legislator, out of the fact that the legislator are captured by the casino industry that does not want competition. So the Mississippi people are protected by the competition among lobbyings. And I'm sure that if any of the PhD student is listening here, there is a fantastic study of doing some discontinuity analysis around the border between Mississippi and Louisiana to see to what extent this stuff is hurtful to people. In your book, you mentioned that there are some studies, and I would like to know about that. There are some studies, but they're not precise. And now with this discontinuity, you can do like a very nice study.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, first of all, the gambling has always created sort of strange bedfellows of you get sort of Christian pastors alongside casino executives, both lobbying, against online casino legalization or online sports betting in this case. So that is sort of held true in this case. The studies that you mentioned, which again maybe are part of the calculus by these states, is why they don't want to sort of enter into online specifically, are they're aggregate level studies, but it's the kind of methodology that you're both probably familiar with, which is when you have a product that is rolled out in many different states over the course of different times, you can sort of track, okay, Indiana legalizes it here, but Montana doesn't, or Montana legalizes it a few months later. So can we compare Indiana and its arrival of online sports betting there, just for example, as compared to sort of a control state to Indiana before or other states at the same time, and see what the effects are of online sports betting. So these are not causative. I think that would be going too far to say that they're causative, but they're sort of very strong correlational studies. And the strong correlational studies that we do have show a 25 to 30% increase in personal bankruptcies, increase in auto loan delinquencies, increase in use of debt consolidation loans in states within a few months following the arrival of online sports betting, as well as reduced savings and investments in low-income households, as well as increased cases of childhood neglect. And there's some debate about this, but about cases of domestic violence as well. So these are aggregate statistics. These are correlational, but those seem to be at a broad level within a few months of the arrival of online sports betting. That those are the kinds of things we start to see.
Sorry, and there is no study on suicide, because I thought that the increase in suicide is quite significant, no?
Gambling addiction is the addiction with the highest correlation to suicide, and we don't have great data on this yet, but it sort of seems to be inevitable that rates of gambling addiction will increase with the increase in the number of people who are engaging in gambling. But I have not yet seen a definitive study that says suicide is going up specifically associated with gambling addiction yet. I'm assuming that study is probably being worked on right now. If not, one of your PhDs can get on it.
When the law was changed in Colorado and elsewhere, proponents have always implied that so much gambling happens anyway that making it legal wouldn't so much expand it as it would simply siphon illegal players into a taxed marketplace. And that's true of almost anything that is legalized, in the sense it's true of the argument to legalize drugs. It was true of the argument to legalize marijuana. How true is it in the case of sports gambling?
It's sort of true. It's a little bit true. It's not true to the tune of like Adam Silver wrote in a New York Times op-ed. He borrowed this number from somebody else, but that they made up this projection of like $300 billion being bet off illegally in the United States, which would be like, was some non-insignificant percentage of the country's GDP. So I don't think that amount is being gambled illegally. So there are, of course, neighborhood bookies. There are offshore casinos, illegal casinos, operations based in Curacao or wherever, where people were gambling and are gambling. To me, what has happened is that the persistence of some of these illegal gambling operations has provided sort of political cover for the industry to get whatever it wants, and to say, oh, you can't, this is a big fight happening in Illinois right now. Oh, you can't increase our taxes. That's just going to be a gift for the offshore industry. Oh, you can't, investigate our practices of limiting big time winners. That's going to be a gift for the offshore industry. Except anyone who is going to gamble legally is gambling legally. They're not waiting 7 years, 8 years and saying, oh, you know what, I'm ready to cut ties with my bookie. I'm going to go over to FanDuel now. No, there was sort of an initial conversion period that happened around 2018, or as states arrived in the legal sports gambling market after 2018. Just to take the example of marijuana that you mentioned, is of course you do get converts from the black market, but you also get a huge increase in users of people who never would have been caught dead in using the black market, who are now going to access it, not to mention the fact that now you can do it sleekly on your phone with a credit card. So yes, there is a black market for gambling. No, it has not been sort of destroyed, let's say, by legalization in the way the proponents had claimed. And no, it never will be. There is some truth to your point and the persistence of the black market, but not as much as the industry might have you believe.
As we know, addiction is particularly attractive when people don't have a lot of other things in their lives. What is scary to me is that this betting really hit very hard young white males at a time where they're really falling behind. In a sense, if we look at the application for college, we look at their career path, etc., males are really on the losing side of the equation. You now introduce an opportunity to basically give them a rush of dopamine when they can't get satisfaction in a lot of other parts of their life. Surprise,
what could go wrong?
Exactly.
Yes. So just to be clear, studies show that roughly almost half of American men between the ages of 18 through 49 have a sports betting account on their phone. And I think there's lots of factors to explain sort of why it's specifically young men who are, getting involved in sports gambling and maybe even running into trouble, ranging from young men or having slowly developing prefrontal cortices that inhibit their risk decision making, a risk tolerance, I think, among young people generally, especially young men, and a sense of overconfidence about all sorts of things, maybe even particularly sports. And then not to mention the sense of what Kyla Scanlon calls financial nihilism among young people, and maybe young men specifically, who, as you said, sort of have lower educational attainment, lower success rates at the lower ends of the labor market, who, if they have $10,000, $20,000, that's not enough anymore to buy a house. That's not enough anymore to pay off a student loan, but maybe it's enough to run it up to $100,000 or $1 million if you can hit a parlay on the Knicks game tomorrow night. So I think any of those factors, not to mention all the design features of the apps that are sort of designed, to get these young men in, I think all of those probably help explain a lot of why it's young men that are being specifically targeted and specifically harmed.
So I don't know if there's a quantitative answer to this question, but I'm interested in your take on it. Given that gambling has always been with us, I don't know if it's one of the original sins or if it should be one of the original sins, but I don't know my Bible in addition to not knowing my sports or my gaming. But anyway, that aside, is there an argument that we're different today because of these dynamics you're talking about, and that this legalization of gambling in many different forms is meeting a moment in time that makes it particularly dangerous? Or are we always as we were, and this is just taking advantage of human nature as it has always been?
I'm sympathetic to that a little bit, that this is just sort of humans are sort of hardwired to enjoy gambling, and I'm sympathetic to the point that this is just sort of the next natural evolution of gambling in human life. But to me, there's some stepping stone sort of to Luigi's question earlier. Once you put it on a cell phone, and once you allow you can gamble multiple mortgage payments on Malaysian women's doubles badminton or whatever. Like, you couldn't do that in ancient Rome. Like, yes, there are probably stories from ancient Rome of people who gambling all their money and going broke. But there have always been people driven to ruin by gambling. But I think there have never been this many people been driven to ruin this easily, and never, at least in American history, has American government done so much to enable them to fall into ruin so easily.
Also, I think that with other forms of addictions, think about alcohol, we have social norms and legal liabilities that try to discourage people from, for example, serving alcohol if you're drunk. Here is the other way around. And I'm sorry to say, we, in the sense of category of business school professor, led the way into this because, as you probably know, Jonathan, gambling industry used to be run by the mafia that was very good in enforcement, but thank God not very good in marketing. And it turns out that it was taken over by business school professors who are very good in marketing and who have worked for the mafia because they actually introduce frequent gambling cards. They introduce all the psychological tricks to make people more addicted. It's like we know who drink a lot and we send them special drinks and free drinks every time they try to be sober. We target, what is the AAA, what is the Anonymous Association? We know if you belong to that, and every time you go to the meetings, we send you a whiskey or your favorite drinks so that you get addicted again. This is unbelievable.
Yeah. And so just be clear in terms of the legal infrastructure and the legal standards in the way that they're different, right? So with alcohol, as you mentioned, we have these things called dram shop laws, where if a bar sort of overserves someone and that person goes and runs over someone's mailbox or drives into someone's house with their car, the bar can be held legally liable for sort of purposefully overserving. But we don't have any standard in that way for casinos, quote unquote, purposely overserving, or the equivalent of sort of taking someone's money, even when they know that that person is over their skis or is addicted or shouldn't be gambling as much as they are. And there's no equivalent sort of legal protection. And I don't long for the days of the mob. And Luigi, I'd love to see you sort of try to club someone's knees when they can't pay their marker. But I think there's something to be said for sort of deprofessionalizing the industry a little bit and making it a little bit. I understand the nostalgia, sort of the Martin Scorsese sort of appeal of that old days of gambling as a result because of what we have now.
The evil done by MBAs. If you have, and maybe this is an oversimplification, but if we have three players here, people, governments, and companies, who's winning, who's losing, and how much?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll just include sports leagues. Let's call it in the companies.
Okay.
They don't
right.
sort of
okay.
they sort of indirectly benefit. And okay, let me be really clear because I don't want to make it sound like everyone who has a FanDuel app on their phone is addicted to gambling. Right, 60% of people who gamble on the NFL account for roughly 1% of sportsbook revenue when it comes to football betting. So a large percentage of gamblers, and this is, as you know, true for lots of other industries as well, but a large percentage of the people involved in gambling are effectively meaningless or unimportant when it comes to the companies. It's that 82% of the revenue that's coming from just 3% of gamblers. That's sort of where the money's coming from. Some of those people are really, really rich. Some of those people are not rich, and they're like the guys I profile in the book who sort of get over their skis. So those are clear losers, is not the Michael Jordans of the world who can gamble $1 million on blackjack if they want to, but sort of like the guys in the book, like Kyle, who just like lost all his money for 3 years and sort of that's it. So those are some clear losers. States are not nearly as big winners as they would have you believe in terms of the fact that sports gambling is a extremely low margin business even for the sports gambling companies. And then the states are just taking in most cases a relatively small percentage of sportsbook tax on sportsbook profit, in some cases as low as 10%. So sure, it's helping, but pun intended for Colorado, it's like a drop in the bucket for the water revenue. And then the companies, these are companies that just wouldn't exist, were it not for sports gambling. I don't want to say that Jason Robbins, the CEO of DraftKings, is sort of diving into a bucket full of gold coins at the end of the night. And these are stakeholder accountable companies like everybody else. But no, this is a big industry, specifically online sports gambling, that really didn't exist prior to 2018 in any real way, and is now propped up by the losses of primarily a small percentage of participants in the product.
Now, what is scary is that these people know exactly who is addicted because they have all the information and they don't do anything about it, while at the same time, you teach me, they are prohibiting people who are professional bettors from participating too often. So they identify pretty quickly if you are a good bettor and they exclude you. But not only they don't exclude you if you're about to go bankrupt, they actually seek you out.
Right, and this is what's frustrating to me, and sort of embodies sort of the recklessness, which is, and this is not me sort of speculating. This is, I've watched a talk given by a Fanatics executive who sort of says this explicitly at a Sloan conference a few years ago, where she says, we have all this data. We know if you're depositing more money more quickly than you used to, if you're placing more bets on a weeknight, if you're getting a bunch of credit card deposits that are declined, we can tell if you are running into trouble, if you are gambling more than you should, if your sort of risk factor is going up per se. So the question is, okay, it's amazing that Fanatics has that data, but who at Fanatics has that data and what is it being used for? Is it the so-called responsible gambling team that is charged with sending you an email saying, hey, Luigi, like you need to chill out, you need to take a break, we're cutting you off from our app for a little while? Or is it the VIP team at Fanatics whose job it is to sort of entice big bettors? So that I don't mean to pick on them. There's sort of every company I think has the exact same data and would do the exact same thing. But I generally don't know. We don't have evidence yet as to how this data is being used. But the data they have would make Las Vegas of the 1950s weep in terms of their ability to sort of target players as a result. And these companies could be sort of forced to leverage it in sort of more positive ways.
That's really interesting. We need a deep dive into these companies the way people have done with Facebook or Meta.
Right. I'm just waiting for someone to leak it. As long as they leak it to me, that's great. But, they can leak it to you, Bethany, but other than that.
For anybody who's listening out there, you can leak it to me too.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So given that states aren't winning the way they perhaps thought they would, I understand the desperation of states struggling with budget issues, thinking we'll just go all in on this. But given that they aren't winning the way they thought they would, why is no one willing to do anything about this? Or maybe to ask the question a different way, what happens to the people who are trying to do something about it?
Yeah, well, hopefully people like me, they don't end up like with their kneecaps broken in the desert or something. But if something does happen, now you know why. I think states, and so my last book is on the American state lottery system. And my fear actually with all of this sports gambling is that it winds up like the lottery, in that Americans spend, primarily poor Black and brown Americans, less educated poor Black and brown Americans, spend around $120 billion on lottery tickets every year, and nobody cares. Nobody talks about it. It's not an active policy conversation. It's just sort of baked into the model. And states, you would think in the same way, especially, progressive state, like I'm from Massachusetts originally. Massachusetts has the most profitable lottery in the country. But you would think that a social justice-oriented progressive state like Massachusetts surely would never profit $1 billion off the backs of poor Black and brown people in the state. But they do. And I think gambling has sort of always been a blind spot for progressives and for social justice-minded people. And sports gambling is sort of still so new. And still so, I think people still are drinking the Kool-Aid of, people are going to do this anyway. We might as well have it licensed. We might as well make some money from it. So I don't know if it's hit home yet, sort of these negative consequences. And ironically, the thing that's going to make it hit home is not going to be, I think, people like me talking on podcasts about aggregate studies of auto loan delinquencies. I think it's going to be things like sports integrity scandals and game rigging scandals that I think is probably going to capture the national attention. That might be the first domino that ultimately gets lawmakers to wake up. I don't care what it does. As long as it wakes them up, that's fine. But I think it's probably going to be something like that rather than concerns over, individual harms.
Which leads to the current NBA scandal. And I wanted to ask...
Which one?
The one that's been rolling out this fall. And I can't believe I know about this, but somehow I happened to see a headline about it. Would it have happened without sports betting?
That's a great question. Yes and no. So for folks who like Bethany are only sort of getting cursory headlines, right? This was back in October, but an active player, an active coach, and a former player were all arrested and charged with various involvement in game rigging scandals. So two of those scandals, Damon Jones and Chauncey Billups, I think those would have been pretty familiar to like the Chicago Black Sox of 1919. They were charged with leveraging insider information to rig performances or to tip off gamblers in advance with information that the public did not have as to how their team or how an individual player would perform. Okay, fine. You know what? That could have happened in 1919. That could have happened in 2019. It could have happened before the Supreme Court decision. Okay. But there's a couple other cases like this too, for Terry Rozier, who's a player on the Miami Heat, by the way, making like $26 million a year. So we can ask why he did any of this, but I don't know. Who was rigging his own performance in a different way, which is, you could bet on, whether Terry Rozier is going to get 8 rebounds or 5 assists or whatever over the course of the night. And people were gambling lots and lots of money that he would not exceed 8 rebounds, 5 assists, whatever the number was. And then lo and behold, he'd check into the game, claim his eye hurt, and then he checks out. By coincidence, he doesn't have 8 rebounds. He doesn't have 5 assists. Everyone who bet on his unders wins a lot of money. And that's not inevitable. That's specifically new. The only reason you can bet on a player like Terry Rozier to have a certain number of rebounds is because of the sort of this technologically supercharged version of sports gambling that we've unleashed specifically since 2018. So are sports gambling integrity scandals inevitable in general? Yes. Is the volume of those scandals and the form of those scandals that we've gotten over the last 8 years or so different, and has it heightened because of the version of sports gambling that we have now? I would say also yes.
One of the things I find fascinating of your book is precisely this kind of normalization of gambling. So the sport industry was against gambling, so much so that, as you said, in the early 90s, they pushed for a legislation trying to prevent the diffusion. And the moment it was legalized, they not only accepted, but they integrated it to their games in an unprecedented way. So I read in your book, because I don't watch these games, that they talk about the bets during the game. So it's become really a normal part of the game in a way that run the risk of bringing down the entire game with the eventual scandal, because there will be a scandal, that's we know for sure, and will be devastating and might bring out the game. Now, my only, and I know I'm going to have the hate of a lot of people, my only hope is this happens in the NFL, so that at least the American football, which is a dangerous sport, will go down the tube, but that's a different story.
Well, this is to Bethany's question earlier about sort of the winners, and I put the sports league sort of in vain with the companies. And I think in the short term, right, the driver here is that gambling, and this is true, gambling drives engagement and interest in sports. And you're more likely to watch more sports, you're more likely to watch a game whose sort of outcome has been decided when you have money on it. And I can say this is true for myself. It's just more fun to watch a sports game when you've gambled on it than when you haven't. Okay, fine. But over the long term, you sort of open up yourself to these scandals. And you open yourself up to this possibility that these young men don't actually care about sports. They just care about gambling. And they would be gambling on Robinhood if they could. Well, they are gambling on Robinhood, but they would gamble on all sorts of other things that don't involve sports. And they just happen to have chosen basketball or whatever as the vehicle. And they don't have the underlying love, let's say, for the product itself. They just want the gambling on top of it. So I think in the short term, it's sort of driving the league's revenue upward and interest in their product upward. But over the long term, it feels a bit like a Faustian bargain that I don't know if they sort of reckon with they're yet another entity that hasn't reckoned with the consequences of sort of going all in, pun intended, on the gambling economy.
And what do you think the consequences are if people lose trust in sports and start to think that sports are as rigged as other things in our society? Do you speculate or have thoughts about what the damage might be to our societal fabric?
Yeah, well, trust is already in such high supply across American life that what could go wrong? Yeah, right. No, I think, so this was actually a fear of the sports leagues in the early 90s when they got PASPA passed, was someone would interpret routine player or referee error, which is, of course, a sort of basic part of sports, as Luigi, as an Italian soccer fan, knows full well, right? They would interpret that not as a result of sort of something that happens in sports, but as a result of someone being bribed or some rigged performance being.
As by the way, the Italians always interpret like that because there is a team, Juventus, that is owned by a big industrialist, and they always think that Juventus has bought all the referees.
Well, that's actually sort of the point. Is even before 2018, Americans, being so trusting in our institutions, were already prone to thinking that the NFL was rigged on behalf of the Kansas City Chiefs or whatever, and then now layer on gambling money. But not just sort of at the highest corporate level, but also at the individual level. Oh, Bethany has $10 on the Eagles, and there's a holding call against them. Oh, that's such BS. Oh, this isn't just something that happens in a football game. This is the league screwing me over because they know that I gambled on it and they want me to lose. So again, I think not that sports were always such a great vessel for American trust, but if it was sort of, let's consider football as sort of indistinguishable from Americana in many ways, as being maybe one of the last great elements of the monoculture, and maybe gambling is, sort of to Luigi's point, the one thing that's going to bring it down or that will sort of topple it from its place in American life. You're welcome, Luigi, or congratulations for whenever that happens.
So switching gears a little bit to these new, they're not gambling platforms. They are, Kalshi is a prediction market, and I think Polymarket is an information tool. What do you make of these claims?
Very generous of you to describe them that way. Yes.
Thank you. What do you make of these claims that this isn't gambling, that this is a prediction market, is an investment platform, is an information tool? And would this be possible if it weren't for what has happened to with sports gambling? Is there a link between the two?
Yeah. Okay. Let me take the last part of your question first, because I think it's really important, and it sort of speaks to this recklessness thesis, right? Which is that had we proceeded with sort of more care and more caution, we might have figured out how to draw the line between things like investment and gambling before we sort of stumbled into this conundrum of prediction markets and the total blurring of the line between gambling and investing that we've now allowed to happen over the last few years. So this is just yet another manifestation of, if these companies had just been a little bit more careful and a little bit slower, we would have ended up with a better outcome for all involved. So prediction markets, just for folks who don't know, are legally speaking, sort of to Bethany's point, are legally speaking not gambling. They are legally speaking investment platforms. And as such, they are regulated not by states, but at the federal level by the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. Because technically, these platforms, which started out as a forum for election betting, but since last year have basically become sports betting platforms. 90 to 95% of the betting volume on Kalshi is on sports. And so what these, again, it sort of seems quirky and seems weird. Oh, you can gamble on like who's going to be a bridesmaid in Taylor Swift's wedding. Oh, you can gamble on the gas prices in Miami tomorrow. But in practice, in reality, this is a platform for people who are who are between the ages of 18 and 20, who are not allowed to legally gamble on sports in most states. And they are a platform for people in California, Texas, Minnesota, South Carolina, Georgia that don't have legal online sports gambling yet to gamble on sports. So these are so obviously gambling. I know it looks different. I know it's technically regulated like an investment contract, whatever. It's so obviously just gambling on sports. And the companies themselves have sort of completely blurred the line in their own advertising. In courts, they'll claim that they're investment platforms. In their advertising, they'll say they're gambling. They're facing all sorts of legal lawsuits as a result. It's just so obviously gambling that I just don't like it when the companies claim they're one thing and whatever. Well, sorry.
Looks like a duck.
Yeah,
Looks like a duck,
exactly.
quacks like a duck, right?
Yeah, gambles like a duck. Yes, exactly.
Okay. And then the second part about would this have happened if it weren't for sports gambling?
Right. So that's where I think where the recklessness comes in. But I think where we sort of elevated the cultural place of gambling to such a degree, Luigi used the word, normalized. We've normalized it to such a degree that no wonder a 19-year-old who's legally not allowed to access it other than Wyoming, Washington, D.C., and Kentucky, no wonder that a 19-year-old is going to want to find a way to gamble, and that a prediction market sort of has a natural sort of stepping stone into a vacuum to fill in the gambling economy. So yeah, maybe. And again, and prediction markets have been around for a long time. My brother lost $2,000 on Hillary Clinton to win the 2016 election on some prediction market, but they weren't nearly this prominent. And sports betting, I think, elevated the cultural place of gambling to such a degree that all forms of gambling have benefited, including these prediction markets, which are maybe the Achilles heel for the sports betting industry.
I had one more. I do want to talk about solutions. I am concerned about solutions, but I had one more kind of philosophical question, which is, can you define a difference between gambling and investing? Is there a line? What should the line be?
I would point that question to our resident business school professors. But to me, and investing has to be productive in some manner. That is not, I'm investing in the New England Patriots to win the Super Bowl. The New England Patriots are not more likely to win the Super Bowl for me having invested and bought an event contract that predicting that they will. So if anything, sort of the prediction market platform, for example, is more like, let's say, speculation than it is investing, and maybe even speculation is too generous. Again, because there's no sort of secondary means other than your entertainment. I guess that's where I would draw the line, is gambling as a form of entertainment. Of course, some people do it professionally, but gambling primarily as a form of entertainment, and investing, even speculation, as sort of at least nominally serving some other purpose, justifiable purpose. And to me, gambling on an Eagles parlay, or investing, in an Eagles parlay, just does not pass the sniff test in that regard.
Okay, let's try to move to solutions. We've complained enough. If we want to legalize betting in a non-reckless way, what should we do?
So the byword for any solution, to me, is friction. To the point earlier about sort of the app design and wanting to make it not impossible. To the conversation earlier, you're never going to eliminate gambling addiction. There are always going to be some Americans or some people who run into trouble. Estimates are that basically under any circumstances, roughly 1% of American adults are going to have a gambling addiction of some kind. The question is not to eliminate gambling addiction, but to make it almost impossible for the snowball to start gathering velocity as it rolls down the hill. So putting basically as many speed bumps as possible to prevent someone from rolling from that 60% of bettors who provide 1% of revenue into those higher categories, into that 3% of bettors who provide 82% of the revenue. Number one would be limiting what's called loss chasing, which is, Luigi loses money on Italian football. Oh, he's so mad. Oh, now he's going to go gamble on Czech table tennis. Oh, he's so mad. Now he's going to go gamble on the Singapore Open, and so on. And he's increasing his bet amount each time. And that, to me, that's a clear indicator of sort of gambling related harm and sort of someone rewiring their dopamine pathways on the fly. And things like that would slow it down and slow down the user experience would be sort of the byword for me. And I'm open to basically almost any solution that instills friction onto these currently frictionless apps.
So let me try another solution that is not specific to this, but I was reading the latest book by Yuval Harari, Nexus. He makes an excellent and exposed obvious point, which is when we give our data to our doctor or our accountant or a lawyer, they have a fiduciary duty of using those data only in our interest. So if we had a general rule that say whoever accumulate data from you has a fiduciary duty to exercise in your interest. I actually might be interested in being informed that there is a bet on whether Italy will qualify to the World Cup. There is still a small chance. But I don't want to be bombarded with all the possible manipulation possible in the face of Earth. And so I think that having a bright general rule in which you put fiduciary duty to everybody who collects our data will fix this problem, will fix a lot of other problems in our economy.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way. I think that that's fair. I think, again, to the point earlier, the companies have so much data on individual gamblers and leverage that in such nefarious ways that I'm not going to say that this is like my advisor at TIAA who is sort of telling me how to invest my money, but like at the very least, they shouldn't be trying to drive me to financial ruin. The joke, you can shear a sheep many times, but you can only slaughter it once. Right now, the companies are just slaughtering away, and just on the assumption that there's sort of always more market share. There's new states, California, Texas are going to come on board eventually. They can just slaughter sort of with impunity. And what you're describing is basically would be a sustainable gambling economy where the companies have a responsibility to shear and not to slaughter.
If you had to bet as to whether there will be
for my job.
Okay.
I do, yes.
Okay. If you had to bet as to whether there will be A, no solution, no fixes, or B, a solution that's actually a result of the market because the companies have slaughtered instead of sheared, and that either sports leagues start to say having people question the honesty of sports outcomes isn't great for us, or these lawsuits as prediction markets have morphed into sports betting platforms, that there is some kind of pushback that way? Or would you think that states and governments need to take action?
Well, I don't trust Congress to do anything anymore. And states are, and as we said, it's not a lot of money, but they sort of are susceptible, especially to lobbying and even to whatever money does come in. So I would bet on sort of option B of some scandal breaking through. Again, it might not be a scandal of public health. It might be a scandal of sort of sports integrity, but meaningful self-regulation. What I would call meaningful, what the companies would call meaningful is probably different, but sort of that seems to be the most likely solution, at least in the short term, is that there is some sort of reshuffling of the order and of the priorities by the companies. Maybe that's because of a Supreme Court ruling on prediction markets, for example, which some folks in the industry think is going to have to happen eventually because there's so many different state cases that are going to get aggregated into one. Or maybe it's because of the companies are trying to get ahead of congressional legislation, which is what the alcohol and tobacco industries used to do a lot. They would sort of self-regulate to prevent congressional action. That seems to be just like the most likely scenario, given all the players involved, how much money would be spent on lobbying and so on. That to me is why I don't want to wait for any legislation or any self-regulation, and why I think actually public education is sort of the lowest hanging fruit in terms of parents not letting their 16-year-olds have DraftKings on their phone, which is sort of what a lot of folks did because this is fun. Let's gamble together. Let's do it on your phone, Johnny. And like, lo and behold, that's a terrible idea. And I think in the way that we've sort of now know to talk to kids about porn, about alcohol, about tobacco, and so on, we're playing catch up on that side. So this is sort of a little bit beyond your question. But I think while we wait for that regulation or whatever it is to come through, I think there's a lot of work for regular people that they can do in the meantime.
That's the wrong answer, Jonathan. You should say that your book is the new Sinclair Django. Remember that after Sinclair exposed the meat packing industry in Chicago, the book was actually read by the then President Theodore Roosevelt, who actually pushed for legislation to change and created the Food and Drug Administration to discipline the food market as a result.
Well, if our president knew how to read, maybe he can read my book too. Yeah.
Or if his kids were not involved in this business to the wazoo, yes, that would be the change. I think that's a big problem on that dimension. We are waiting for a whistleblower. The whistleblower of Facebook, for example, was very instrumental. So we're waiting for this to come, and hopefully one of the two of you will write a book with the whistleblower. But also, you mentioned that there are some important legal suits that are taking place against this industry, which might reveal a lot of the problem. Tell us more about those.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different interesting ones. So first, I just mentioned briefly, these are state attorneys general that are suing Kalshi, primarily the prediction market, on the basis to our conversation earlier that these are actually gambling platforms disguised or sort of pretending to be investment platforms. So those are sort of ongoing lawsuits. The furthest one.
And let me guess, all those attorney generals are Democrat.
Actually, it's coming from a variety of states, but you'd be wise to surmise based on the fact that Donald Trump Jr. is paid a special advisor to Kalshi and to its chief competitor, Polymarket. But those, again, as I said, I think are going, because there are so many different lawsuits in so many different states, there's probably going to end up at the Supreme Court is the sort of the prediction. And then there are these sort of cases on the basis of public health being focused on the sports gambling companies themselves. There's a class action lawsuit also in Massachusetts against DraftKings over deceptive advertising. Numerous cases, I think mostly in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, some of which have been settled, some of which are still open, from gamblers themselves, or in one case, it's the wife of someone who, a husband who drained their family's life savings and their kids' college fund based on his gambling addiction. Those would be sort of meaningful pushback. And again, you never know if these just get settled out of court just to get hush-hush, or if this is like the tobacco lawsuits where they failed for 40 years to hold the companies accountable, and then all of a sudden in the 1990s they succeeded in holding the companies accountable. So I think we're in that sense we're progressing faster than the lawsuits against tobacco, but I don't have a bet yet as to whether they're going to succeed and whether that's going to turn the tide in a meaningful way.
If you're enjoying the discussions Luigi and I have on this show, there's another University of Chicago podcast network show you should check out. It's called Entitled. International lawyers Claudia Flores and Tom Ginsburg have traveled the world, getting into the weeds of global human rights debates. On Entitled, they use their expertise to explore the stories and the thorny questions around why rights matter and what's the matter with rights. Subscribe to Entitled, part of the award-winning University of Chicago podcast network.
Before we talked to Jonathan, I actually viewed his book and his suggestions for reform as sort of an attempt to have it both ways, of being fairly moralistic about gambling without being moralistic enough to say it should all go away. But after listening to him and talking to him, I actually think he's right. You're not going to put the genie back in the bottle, and nor maybe should you. But just like with social media, there's a way to keep it from going to the lowest common denominator and from being used in the most nefarious way possible. And I really wish, actually, I think one thing that states should do or the federal government should do is just force all these companies to open up all of their internal emails and let's see what they say about where they're making their money and how they're luring people into this. Or maybe they don't. Maybe it's a lot more innocent than we all think.
That's the reason why I thought was very interesting the legal case that Northeastern University is helping to bring, because litigation brings a lot of discovery. Once you have discovery, it's very difficult to avoid the facts. This could be not only a way to address this problem, but I see this as simply one example of a general problem we need to address, because it is the same, actually, maybe because I like wine, but actually the wine industry is the least sophisticated in that dimension. And part of it is because it's very fragmented. You don't have a big wine producer. You do a big beer producer, of course, liquor producer, but not wine producer. And two, maybe it's because historically it's less sophisticated. In this case, sophistication is bad because it gives you all the tricks to make more money by working on margins where you don't want to work on. I think that, but it's not just the betting industry, it's the social media industry, it's the food industry. This is a general problem that, in my view, needs a general solution. So that's the reason why I'm not so keen on these bumps on the road. In a sense, if you are trying to quickly legislate something in order to minimize the damage, I think the bumps in the road are probably the right direction to go. But if you really want to address the problem, you need some sort of global solution like the one that I was mentioning of making this company fiduciaries.
I really like that solution. I was actually thinking, though, I was still stuck back on this old libertarian argument about let people do whatever they want, which I guess I must have a core of inner libertarian because that was my first thought on this. But I think maybe the better analogy, instead of the wine industry, it's actually speeding laws, right? I don't know many people out there who say there should be no speed limits and cars should just be able to drive wherever they want to on the road. And if you can't get out of the way of an oncoming semi, so what? I mean, we all agree that there are certain rules of the road that aren't everybody's interest simply because the societal cost is too high otherwise. And if Jonathan's statistics are all right, and I'm sure they are, then the societal cost of this is really high. I mean, even for state governments, if you have people being bankrupted and having to go on welfare or get unemployment because they can no longer hold down a job because they're addicted to gambling, it doesn't take too long before it's not a revenue generator at all. It's actually a huge cost once you take into account the mental health care costs especially. And I think because it is a societal cost, it's not just people themselves who bear the harm from their actions. It's all of us. And so there is a legitimate case to be made for speed bumps or for a broader solution.
I think that we need to understand that people here are weak. To me, what has changed vis-a-vis John Stuart Mill, when John Stuart Mill was writing this stuff, the techniques to seduce you, if you want, were not that sophisticated. But now they are so good, you must be Jesus to resist the temptations.
Yes, I think that actually is a really also fundamental point in his book and a truth of the whole thing, which is that the tools that make us addicted are so much more sophisticated than they used to be. And so as the world adapts and as corporations become perhaps more evil than they once were, at least some corporations become more evil than they once were, in the sense that the name of the game in too many places does seem to be this race to the bottom, then you do need a different system of regulation, because if companies aren't going to police themselves and the market isn't going to make them police themselves, and the temptations are being, the dial is being turned from 1 to 11, see my Spinal Tap reference, then we need something needs to be done.
No, I think it's very scary because in his book, he has this line that made me jump when he say, gaming interests got the rules they wanted not through subterfuge or regulatory capture, but because the state's gaming officials, like its lawmakers, had a vision for sport betting fundamentally aligned with the industry. So this is a level of capture which is above and beyond. And actually, I was thinking, if an economic researcher were to measure, there's not a lot of trace of lobbying here. So the industry is not very influential. No, because it's so hegemonic that controls the very culture of the state assembly. This is like how scary this is.
That's so funny. I had highlighted that line too, and it made me think about something I've argued in the past, which is that implicit corruption is almost more dangerous than explicit corruption, meaning that in explicit corruption, you might be able to trace the bag of cash that was handed over to the person in order to do the thing that they weren't otherwise going to do. But implicit corruption, where everybody already thinks the same way because all of their incentives are aligned, that's almost uglier.
It is ugly, there's no question.
So the one place I wasn't sure I agreed with him on, and I'm not sure I don't, I think I need to listen to it again, but when I asked him to draw the line between what gambling is and what investing is, I'm not really sure, because there certainly are some forms of investing. I guess investment banks have always argued, or traders always argue, it's the efficient allocation of capital. And so maybe you can argue there's a larger societal utility to that, but there are certain forms of investing, whether it's, highly leveraged option strategies or bets today on cryptocurrencies, that do come awfully close to gambling. And I'm not sure his definition works as a way of drawing the line between the two.
Actually, I think it does work well in drawing the line, but not every financial investment, so-called financial investment, is not betting. So
maybe that's the point.
That's exactly the point. Because, take, for example, futures on the price of corn. Okay, you can think of those as simple bets on something, but in reality, they play a very important function for farmers when they need to plant their seeds. So there is a real function. Now, unfortunately, in many markets, the real function has become small and the financial side much bigger, which has created volatility, all the problems associated. But I think at least in the original incarnation, that was the function, and very useful. Now, you're right that investment bankers started to develop more and more complicated tools. And actually, some of them revealed me that was an armed war in which you basically created very complicated tools to test how the other investment bank will price them, to see how smart they were or not smart. So at some point, it became completely a betting game. Yeah. But that definition will help us separate the wheat from the chaff.
I'm not sure, because under your argument that, say, the price of corn futures does provide a valuable service to farmers, then Kalshi and Polymarket could also argue, and you could even see a sports betting company twisting this to make the argument that, say, on Kalshi, if people are betting whether there's going to be a ceasefire in Gaza, that could be incredibly useful information for people who need to figure out world peace. I worry that could open itself to an argument that involves a lot of sophistry, where people are playing word games.
Yeah, but I'm very much an empirical guy. You can look at what fraction of those bets are for hedging purposes and what fraction are complete uncorrelated. And I think that you will see that certainly the bets on the sports are not really helping anybody hedging any particular risk. I would say 99.9% of those bets are complete, just pure bet. I don't know recently what is in the future market, but hopefully is a little bit better.
So would you set a hard limit then?
Yeah, I think that, for example, I will treat them from a tax point of view in a completely different way. If you find enjoyment, I have nothing against finding enjoyment, but if you find enjoyment in something that does not have other big social purposes, I tax you like I tax any other enjoyment. On the other hand, if you are trying to provide a useful purpose, maybe I tax you a little bit less. One other idea I had reading his book is currently you can deduct up to 90% of your losses from your gains when in a report on the income taxes. I don't see any reason why you should deduct your losses. In a real investment situation, you are actually promote investment, and so you want to try to get more of it. But here, there's no way you want to promote it. You eat your losses, and you pay full income taxes on your gains.
But I still think you're ducking my question, Luigi, and maybe I just didn't hear it. But my question is, if something has to have a utility for it to be investing and not gambling, if it has to serve a purpose, at what limit would you say? Does it have to be at least 10% useful? Does it have to be 15% useful? Does it have to be 50% useful? What would you, where would you draw the line? Does it have to be 1% useful? If it has any use case at all, then do we make a case that it's investing instead of gambling?
I think it's also a function of the size of the market. In a sense, if you have a gigantic market, but 1% is useful, maybe there is some utility of having the overall market overall. But if you have a very small market and only 1% of that is as a function, then the social loss of shutting down the market is very small.
Okay, I'll take that.
Sure.
Capitalisn't is a podcast from the University of Chicago Podcast Network and the Stiegler Center in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. The show is produced by me, Matt Hodap, and Leah Cesarine, with production assistance from Utsof Gandhi, Matt Lucky, Sebastian Burka, Andy Shee, and Brooke Fox. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to take our conversation further, also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stiegler Center, and subscribe to our newsletter. Sign up at chicagobooth.edu/Stiegler to discover exciting new content, events, and insights. We hope you'll join our community, again at chicagobooth.edu/Stiegler.